Just ahead, there's another edition of the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and in the Orlando area of Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political analyst and commentator Al Spry. Reagan, this will be a fun one for the Thanksgiving and holiday season. We're speaking with historian Gragg about the Pilgrims.
His brand new book, The Pilgrim Chronicles, an eyewitness history of the Pilgrims and the founding of Plymouth. You thought you knew it all? I'll bet you he's going to tell you some things you've never heard before. Stay put. The Florida Roundtable begins following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political commentator Al Spry. It's great to be here with you, Reagan, as always.
Always a pleasure, Al. And I didn't mean to overlook the fact that we are also on Tough TV 38 in the Orlando area.
That's right. Wednesdays, Saturdays, Sundays at 9 a.m. on Tough TV 38, which you can get over the air with an HD antenna. You can get from Radio Shack or Target or Best Buy, and then you can watch us right over the air in HD quality. Also, we're available in selected communities. And if you want to get some Tough TV, call your cable or satellite operator and ask for it. Say, I want my Tough TV.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'm going to have to get tough on you, Heine. Now let's do a little bit of housework here on the fallout from the Ferguson story.
Yes,
which, of course, is a national story, international. The president spoke on this past week about using his last 2 years in office to take on the problems of race and policing, illustrated by the controversy previously mentioned. But for now, he's offered policy solutions that fall short, according to some, of what activists have demanded. He had some activists at the White House. His quote is, "There have been commissions before, there have been task forces, there have been conversations, and nothing happens." So he added, what I try to describe to people is why this time will be different. I don't know. Those words seem hollow to me. Everyone always says things are going to be different.
Some of those people in attendance call this a Band-Aid approach, which historically I would think usually is the type of answer that the federal government comes up with.
Yes,
put a Band-Aid on it.
You know, here's one of these initiatives. They announced that it would establish $75 million in funding each year to help local police departments buy at least 50,000 cameras that officers would wear on their bodies when interacting with the public. But, of course, there have to be rules attached to these cameras. I think the cameras are a good idea. It helps the police officer. It helps the people that the police officers are confronting and interrogating, because it gives you the full story. It's not he said, she said, he said, or whatever. So that's probably a positive move if they could make it work.
Yeah, and I think there's the operative word, because in many cases these body cameras have not been perfected, and many times they don't function all that well. And there have been many instances of questions, matter of fact, made into TV dramas on police shows about the failure of the body cameras, and still depending on eyewitnesses to come forward.
I think body cameras are a good idea as long as you perfect the technology.
You can make them work,
and you make them work. I think that the cameras in the cars have been very helpful for police officers and for the public at large. But what the president didn't do was criticize the behavior of the police in Ferguson. He and his aides would not commit to a presidential visit to Ferguson. He rejected calls to end the program. Instead, he defended the Pentagon initiative that sends excess military equipment, including Humvees, to local police departments. I am troubled by that, Reagan, as you know, and I don't think that we should be equipping our police like we do our military.
And a lot of that excess stuff has found its way to Florida.
Yes, and you know, I just don't think, especially in smaller communities, you need to have tanks rolling down the streets. I think it sets a bad precedent towards an idea of having a police state, and that's not what America's about, Reagan.
Well, no, I'm with you 100% on that. It's an ongoing problem, and it's not going to go away. We'll have to watch. The governor of Missouri is impaneling a commission on local leaders and state people that want to take a look at this thing. And I guess it seems to me that the true reaction and repair work has got to come on a more local level.
Sure.
Big Brother can't sit there in Washington and say, well, they can sit there and say it. But when it comes right down to it, it's the people in your community that have to make this work.
That's right. It's a bottom-up idea of providing opportunities for all people, regardless of race, creed, color, or religion. And it's about just doing the right thing.
That well said, Al. All right, well, let us take a pause along our network line here. We'll remind folks that they are listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks, and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
We will be joined by historian Rod Gragg and his new book, The Pilgrim Chronicles, as our conversation continues in a moment. We're back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks, and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And Al, as promised, we are joined at this point in the program by historian and author Rod Gragg. He has been here before. We visited with him some months back. He put out a huge volume on the Battle of Gettysburg. And he's got another book, brand new book out for Regnery History Publishing, The Pilgrim Chronicles, an eyewitness history of the Pilgrims and the founding of the Plymouth Colony. And Rod, welcome back to the Florida Roundtable.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
Well, it is a pleasure to have you here, sir. And for those who may not have heard our last visit, why don't you go ahead and take the first minute or so and tell us a little bit about your own personal background?
Well, I appreciate that. I'm a historian. Prior to that, I was a journalist, and I am the director of the Crestcom Bank Center for Military and Veteran Studies at Coastal Carolina University in South Carolina. And this book, The Pilgrim Chronicles, an eyewitness history of the Pilgrims and the founding of Plymouth Colony, is newly published by Regnery History.
Well, you did such a massive volume on Gettysburg, and this one matches it easily with commentary and all the illustrations. But what drove you towards the Pilgrims? What light came on in your head and said, "Hey, somebody needs to do a new book about Pilgrims"?
Well, I would like to claim there was great inspiration, but it was actually my publisher's idea.
Okay.
And,
but that kind of makes it easier, right?
Here,
write this book about the Pilgrims.
Right. Well, actually, the book you mentioned before, the Illustrated Gettysburg Reader, kind of inspired this one in the sense that book came out last year for the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. About half my work is on the American Civil War. And it is a work that has a narrative that takes the reader through the book, but is highlighted by eyewitness accounts about the Battle of Gettysburg and the time and the place by people who were there. So the publisher said to me afterwards, that works so well for Gettysburg, why don't we try it with the Pilgrims? And I guess about maybe 4 or 5 of my books have dealt with colonial America and the Revolution. So I was familiar with those folks and was very interested in doing it because I think they are such remarkable people in our history. They are fascinating. And I don't think there are probably many cases in American history where, if any, where so much is owed by so many to so few. As the Pilgrims and what we owe them, to paraphrase Winston Churchill.
Sure. Now, almost everybody in America is familiar with the story of the Pilgrims and all that, coming from the old world, crossing to the new and all that. When you set about this, what in the back of your mind said, can we find something new to say about this or put a new light on things? Was that part of the deal?
That was the part I was interested in because, the image that we Americans have of the Pilgrims, which we kind of resurfaces every year in November, is actually not an incorrect image. It's just that it's so one-dimensional, and there's so much more to these people and so much more to what they did for America. About half of this book is set in England and Holland before they ever reach America. And uses a narrative and eyewitness accounts to reveal who are these folks and why did they feel compelled to leave England and go to Holland and then leave Holland and go to America, and why were they persecuted and who were they and what were their thoughts this was no small thing to decide to go to America in 1619, 1620. There had only been one successful English colony in America at that time, and that at Jamestown. Many others had tried and failed. One shipload of potential colonists shortly before the Pilgrims sailed never made it. They died on ship before they could even get there. And Jamestown was a disaster that almost failed. So for these folks to decide to come to America, one professional soldier among them, men, women, and children, was just an incredible act. And so I felt like, there's so much more to these people, and their impact on us is so great that they really deserve so much more attention. And I got to tell you, I really wasn't disappointed because their story is fascinating.
The Pilgrims and the Puritans, correct me if I'm wrong, were basically the same people, or were those different founders? I hear the terms used interchangeably sometimes, but I wanted to get clarification because it's been a while since I studied that stuff. So,
right, you're hitting close to the mark there. The people we call the Pilgrims were composed of two groups, and they were led by and kind of inspired and driven by a group of people called the Separatists, and they were a sect of the Puritans. And the Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England in the late 16th, early 17th century of what they considered to be unbiblical practices, and the Separatists held that same view. But unlike the mainstream Puritans, they were much less confrontational, and they just wanted to leave. They had a heartfelt belief that the local church should be autonomous, and that church members should choose their own pastors, their own elders, and their own deacons. And they also wanted to worship in a way that they felt like was more biblical than some of the ceremonial practices and priestly garments and these things that were common in the day in the Church of England. Now, that doesn't seem like a great thing to us today, maybe in the 21st century, but it was big then because it put them on the wrong side of the law, because the law in England said that you had to be a member of the Church of England, and you had to be in some measure of good standing, and you couldn't select your own leaders, and you had to follow certain procedures and processes, and if you didn't, then you were considered outside the law and you were a threat. Now, and the reason for that was as much political as it was theological. There really wasn't a lot of difference between the people in the pews who were Anglican, Church of England, and the Puritans and the Separatists in terms of fundamental basic doctrine. They all believed that Jesus Christ was the only way to salvation, and that salvation came from the grace of God through faith in a personal relationship with Christ. So they had that in common. It was the other areas of secondary focus that caused the conflict, and the political side of it was that they all probably would have gotten along pretty well, Puritans, Separatists, and the typical people in the Church of England, but the bishops really saw this view of these people who were considered nonconformists to be a threat to the sovereignty of the monarchy in England.
Yeah, they were big on everybody conforming back in those days. Even, of course, you had the big row between Catholics and Protestants, and even within the Protestant church, it's very interesting how that came about. And so they decided to hightail it. In other words, how many were there?
Well, they were. It's hard to know exactly how many there were in England. There were cells of them in London, and particularly in a place called the East Midlands, where our pilgrims came from. That was 150 miles or so north of London, in a group of villages, Scrooby, Gainsborough, Bapworth, and because they were deemed nonconformist and they felt they were persecuted, They had to pay fines. Sometimes they were imprisoned, men, women, children with them. And in some cases they were executed. So a point in time came about 1617 or so where this group up in the East Midlands, centered around the village of Scrooby, decided to go to Holland. But that was illegal, and that caused a lot of them to be arrested and put into prison. All of this is, you see, the book opens actually with an eyewitness account of a group of Pilgrim men, women, and children, separatists, who were trapped on the coast of England with soldiers approaching who were going to arrest them because they were trying to flee to Holland. And they did flee to Holland, stayed there a while, and then for various reasons they felt compelled to come to America.
So they chose Holland at first because that was more of a liberal bastion as far as religious freedom goes in Europe at the time. Would that be accurate?
Right. The Dutch Reformed Church was the official government denomination, but it was the government was very permissive about people believing what they wanted to believe, and the Pilgrims found real favor in Holland. The Dutch officials really respected them as newcomers and citizens, and they did well there, but life was hard. Women had to go to work as well as the men. They felt like that was really disrupting their family. And over a period of time, they felt like their children were losing their English identity, and they were also afraid that the children were becoming more and more secular because this Holland's culture was kind of like a double-edged sword. It allowed them to have the freedom of faith that they wanted, but at the same time, that same attitude caused the culture to be very secular, and they felt like their children were slipping away from their faith. And then the trigger was a peace treaty that Holland had with Spain was about to end, and some decades earlier, Spain had invaded Holland in unbelievable slaughter. And so these folks felt like they would be chief targets if this peace treaty ended and Spain came back. So they looked around for places to go to try to establish a community of faith, and they finally decided that Wilderness America was the place to go despite its great risks.
And there were certainly great risks. A ship that I had never heard of, the Speedwell.
Right.
Tell us that story.
Well, most people don't know that the Pilgrims actually had two ships. The Mayflower is the one everyone knows. That's the one that made it to America. That ship was leased in England by a group of these folks. The Separatists in Holland were sponsored by investors who felt like there weren't enough of them for a colony, and so they rounded up other folks who had kind of a similar persuasion, but they weren't separatists. They kind of had Puritan leanings, and they became known as the Strangers, and the Separatists and the Strangers together collectively became the Pilgrims, but the driving force were the Separatists. They rounded up a ship in Holland called the Speedwell, which just did not live up to its name at all. And, it kept springing leaks on the voyage. It made it from Holland to England fine, but with the two ships left to go to America, it began leaking in the English Channel, so they put back into Dartmouth to make repairs and set out again. Got out into the Atlantic, started leaking once more, so they put back then into Plymouth and decided then that it was not seaworthy. Now, there's some speculation among the Pilgrims, that the ship's captain of the Speedwell lost his nerve and didn't want to go into the North Atlantic and make that 2-month voyage.
Tell you what, Rod, hang on to that because we need to take a pause along the network line. We'll come back and finish up that story. But let us remind folks that they are listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and of Tough TV 38 in the Orlando area. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest, historian Rod Gragg, the Pilgrim Chronicles. We'll continue our conversation in a moment. From Pensacola to Key West and all points in between, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry. It's great to have Rod Gragg here and his book, The Pilgrim Chronicles.
Yes, sir.
An eyewitness account of the Pilgrims and the founding of Plymouth Colony.
From our friends at Regnery History, and we presume it's available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com. And Rod, you were in the midst of the story of telling the second ship of the Pilgrims, a thing called the Speedwell, and where we left off there was that
it didn't speed well.
Yeah, and there was some notion that the captain didn't have the nerve.
Did have two ships.
Yeah.
And,
So the captain was where did you hear that the captain might have been chicken as far as that goes? From some of the commentary.
Right. Some of the Pilgrim sources indicate that they thought it was possible the captain of the Speedwell didn't want to make the voyage after he committed to it, and so he knew how to sail the ship to take on water. And Speedwell had
interesting
had a career after that without any problems for quite a few years. So we don't know, but they took the Speedwell and the Mayflower and they put them back into Plymouth, and they put everybody who was still willing to go on the Mayflower. That's why the Mayflower, which really wasn't that small a ship for its day, but that's why the Mayflower was so crammed with people on that perilous voyage across the Atlantic.
And, of course, it was a perilous voyage. People, I don't know if people realize how dangerous the North Atlantic can be as far as huge waves and storms and so forth.
Right. Just making it to America was extremely risky. You could die aboard ship of scurvy or of some horrible disease called the bloody flux.
The bloody flux.
The bloody flux.
What the heck is the bloody flux?
Well, I don't know how much you want to talk about it, but it's basically
I'm not sure I want to know.
Well, yeah, just the basic stuff. What is it?
A severe form of dysentery.
Oh my!
And so people would basically, they would just weaken and die. And this happened a lot. And as I mentioned earlier episode, that one ship about the same time heading for America with colonists never made it to America because almost everybody aboard died of scurvy and the bloody flux. And so just getting across the Atlantic, and then you had to deal with the storms. They left late. They were in storm season. They were battered for much of the time. At one point, storm was so bad that the main beam running through the ship cracked, and the Pilgrims really kind of came to the rescue. They had brought some kind of device with them. We don't really know what it was. It was either something related to a printing press or it was a house jack they planned to use to build their homes, and they wedged it up under the main beam, which ran in the ceiling of their cabin, and basically saved the ship from breaking up with everyone being lost.
Wow. How long did it take the journey when they came to America on the Mayflower?
Well, their journey was just over 2 months, and which was very, very difficult, and there were 102 of them, 3 unborn children, so a total 105, and they actually made it across with loss of only 1 life to sickness, and 1 young man was washed overboard, but in an extraordinary manner, which the Pilgrims deemed to be providential, he managed to grab a trailing hawser in the water, a line that was coming out of the ship, and the crew hauled him back up in the middle of a storm. So they made it across without much loss of life, but that first winter, half of them died. They just were... they couldn't imagine how brutal the New England winter could be, and they caught illness and became sick, and just droves of the 18 wives who left England, 13 died.
Wow.
Half the husbands and fathers died. 19 of 29 single men, and 4 entire families, husbands, wives, children, perished. So after that first winter, they were reduced to about half their number.
But a part of the notion that kept them going, coming across the Atlantic and all of this, is the thought that there's going to be nationhood when they get here. Talk about that.
Well, their vision was to live in a place where they would have freedom, including freedom of faith. Now, the great visionary among them was their pastor, John Robinson, who had been an associate pastor in England and in the East Midlands, and then a pastor of the church where they settled in Holland in the city of Leiden. And it was his vision to come to America, but he never came. The idea was that they were going to come in 2 groups, and he would come with the larger group, whichever it was, and after prayer and solemn assemblies, they decided that the larger group would come second, and so he would come later. But they didn't come that way, and he died before he could get to America. But his vision really propelled these folks to America, and they actually landed in the wrong place, which proved to be much to their advantage. They were aiming for the northern rim of Virginia because they had a charter for the Virginia colony, and the northern rim of this giant colony of Virginia in that day would have placed them right at the mouth of the Hudson River where modern New York City is today. And they missed it and came in about 250 miles to the north, tried to get down there and hit rough seas and came back. But that proved to their advantage because they were outside jurisdiction and they were able to create their colony with much more freedom than they would have otherwise.
That's a very interesting point. I don't think a lot of people know. Now let's talk about something like share if you could like a little known fact that from the book that people might not know.
Well, I think there are things small and large that are there that you can see. I think that number one, there was another ship, the Speedwell. Number
Right.
two, they spent this so much of this time in Holland. They also had suffered persecution in England, and this book, The Pilgrim's Chronicles, contains eyewitness accounts that kind of highlight the narrative. And one of them is a letter from a young man who was in prison awaiting to be executed because he'd written a theological manuscript that didn't even get published. And it's a very moving letter that he wrote to his wife and daughters. There also in there are there's kind of a scandalous account of the court of King James, who really wanted to get rid of the Puritans and particularly the separatists. And I think most people don't realize the atmosphere or much about him that's chronicled in this book. And also there is an account by an English official who infiltrated the Pilgrims in one of their house churches describing their worship service. And then a lot of first-person accounts material about they're trying to make it in the wilderness, which was very difficult. One thing maybe that readers aren't aware of is the fact that the Pilgrims actually, contrary to popular opinion today, actually had set a model for other colonists in their relationships with the Native Americans, particularly with the Pokanoket Indian tribe who surrounded the area on Cape Cod Bay where they settled. The first contact that Pilgrims had with Native Americans was an exchange of fire, which was really kind of ironic because they ended up with this 50-year peace treaty that really was kind of an example that so few people on both sides followed after that, particularly the European Americans. So there's just there's a real richness to their story and the impact because they landed outside of their jurisdiction where their charter was. They had to draw up basically a code of laws, and they did that before they ever left ship, and it became known as the Mayflower Compact, and it was arguably the first constitution in America, and it really set a precedent for the Plymouth colony that was for other colonies that followed Plymouth because it established that colony on what would become the twin pillars of colonial America, which was freedom and faith. And this Judeo-Christian worldview that would be followed by all the 13 colonies. If you look at these colonial America, what you see are, in terms of the foundation and the people were the Puritan Congregationalists in New England, the Baptists in Rhode Island, the Presbyterians in New Jersey and Delaware, Quakers in Maryland, Quakers in Pennsylvania, Marylands and Catholics in Maryland, Anglicans in Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, and Jewish communities in New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. So you had this real diversity, but they were all people of the book. And the foundation of the American culture, law, and government, unlike any other nation, therefore, was based on this Judeo-Christian worldview. And that's why it's no accident that the Declaration of Independence begins by stating a belief that all men were created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable or God-given rights such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
And Rod, on that note, we're going to have to take another pause along our network line here. Let us remind folks that they are listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks, and in the Orlando area of Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest today, Rod Gragg, historian, the publisher, Regnery History Publishing, The Pilgrim Chronicles, the book, and we'll continue our conversation in a moment. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks, and in the Orlando area of Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest is historian Rod Gragg. His new book, The Pilgrim Chronicles, an eyewitness history of the Pilgrims and the founding of Plymouth Colony, from our friends at Regnery History, available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com. And Rod, we do appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to visit with us this day about this marvelous book. I want to ask you, the Pilgrims and, of course, Thanksgiving dinner. And I would be willing to put money on the fact that as it has evolved over the years, probably most Americans have a misconception of what that first Thanksgiving dinner really looked like.
Well, I think actually that the general vision that Americans have, or our image, is probably close to the mark. But you're right. There are some things. I think the broad-brimmed hats and the buckled shoes and the black and white bonnets. Those are nice. That's probably not how they dressed. That's more Dutch, and they had been in Holland, but they were English, and they really didn't dress that way. But our Thanksgiving heritage is based on the Pilgrims, but they weren't the first to have a Thanksgiving in colonial America. The Catholic colonists in New Spain had gathered to give God thanks for their survival, and so had the Anglicans at Jamestown before the Puritans, the Pilgrims, reached America. But our Thanksgiving tradition is based on what the Pilgrims did, and their event was a 3-day event, and we presume that it had a joyful worship service. There are 2 accounts of it that give us some information. We know that it was typical in many ways of what they'd done in Holland, what they'd done in England, what the Puritans and Anglicans and others had done, dating back to Lammas Day celebrations in the early church, and then farther back in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament to the Feast of Harvest or the Feast of Tabernacles and Ingathering. So they were following a tradition, and one that they would continue to follow. But it was a 3-day event, and one thing Americans may not realize is that it featured what they called recreations, presumably the field sports that the English people of their day, particularly the Puritans, really loved. And so if they did what others did, then they probably had wrestling matches, foot races, jumping contests. You probably don't think about the Pilgrims in a wrestling match.
No, not normally. That's very interesting.
The equivalent of NFL football or something. And they also had firearms demonstration of some kind. They're on record as saying they had either a shooting match or a firearms demonstration, perhaps they'd invited more than 90 Pokanoket Indians as their honored guests at this event. And we know that they did have turkey, wild turkey. They had what they called waterfowl, which presumably was duck and goose. And the Pokanokets brought venison, which was dressed and cooked on the table. If they ate what they ate later, they might have also had baked beaver, something not typically on the American today.
Baked beaver.
And, baked beaver,
it sounds interesting.
Yeah,
Quite
clams,
appetizing.
fish,
Okay.
Indian corn, beans, peas, etc.
I could dig it, except the baked beaver part. The rest of it sounds pretty appetizing.
So we did start with overeating, probably.
What happened to the Pilgrims? I mean, what came about with them? What did you towards the end of the story here?
Right. Well, like I said, the first winter, about half of them died, and that left about 50. And so when you think about the precedent they set and the impact they had, it's hard to imagine any group of so few people to have such an impact as they did, really, with the Mayflower Compact, with their lifestyle, their laws, their culture, that really set an example. And a major thing that's often overlooked is that their success narrow as it was, really inspired the Puritans of England, who came over a 10-year period between around 1630 to 1640, and they came by the thousands, and not just in a ship or two, but in whole fleets. And they transformed New England and affected all of the other colonies. So, and much of what we view in America today as commonplace, our view of family life, the representative form of government, regular elections, those are things that were really first exercised in a routine and successful way by the Puritans, who were inspired to come by the Pilgrims. And so there's probably no other group of 50 people that had such an impact. And the colony really only lasted about 70 years, and it was folded into the larger Massachusetts Bay colony of the Puritans. So extraordinary people and a remarkable impact that is our legacy today.
Well,
Rod,
thanks, Rod.
We do appreciate all your time this day.
Yeah.
The book, again, is The Pilgrim Chronicles from Regnery History. The author, Rod Gragg, available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and Amazon.com. And, Rod, we do hope you'll come back and do this again soon.
Thank you. My pleasure.
You are listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
Back in a moment. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Enjoyed that conversation with Rod Gragg, Al. I had never heard of the Speedwell, you know?
No, I hadn't either. And we've studied history.
Yeah. So
the poor boat got left to the it could have been made famous, but except that they said the captain maybe didn't have enough gumption.
So you see, no matter how much you think you may know about our history, there's always something out there to learn.
Here's a little history, Reagan. Representative David Richardson, he's a state rep from Miami Beach. He's been selected as the Democratic floor leader by the House Democratic leader Mark Pafford. He is a Democrat of West Palm. And also Democratic leader pro tempore Mia Jones. Richardson will be the first openly gay representative in Florida history to serve in a leadership position in the Florida legislature.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it have been even nicer if there would have been a Republican name in that mix?
Yeah. Well.
You know, it just seems like it's always Democrats. Why is that? That's something that we have to ask ourselves.
Yeah.
Also, we have a little Jeb Bush news. Jeb Bush... last week, he's close to a decision on whether he'll run for the presidency. He implored Republicans on Capitol Hill to use their new majority to show America they can get things done. The quote is, "We don't have to make a point anymore as Republicans. We have to actually show we can, in an adult-like way, govern and lead. This should be a time of incredible possibility." Will it be, though, is the question.
and you know, we're only a year and a half away from the Iowa primaries. Wow.
Of course, Bush's pet project, of course, is Common Core. He says high standards being more important than the label. If you don't measure, you really don't care. He said of unions and other critics of some education reform, non-measurement is the greatest way to make sure that it doesn't matter, that kids can be cast aside. So there's a lot of conservatives who don't like Common Core, but Jeb is one that does. That's one of his things.
And he's garnered the endorsement of his brother, the former president. So we don't know how Mom feels about it, but
and this is interesting. Duke Energy, of course, a big Florida energy company, is watching FPL, another big Florida energy company, request to get into the gas fracking business. FP&L wants to get into natural gas fracking, even though the prices are falling. It doesn't sound like it's economically sound to do this fracking right now. But it wants customers to pay for it, of course.
I was going to say the next step is a special assessment on your and my electric bill.
How do these guys get away with it? Just because they're the electric company? I don't understand this, Reagan.
The State Public Service Commission has to approve it.
Yeah, but they always do because they're the palms
it's
get greased, so to speak. Allegedly, of course.
We no longer have an elected Public Service Commission.
So
Paula Hawkins, where are you when we need you?
And guess what the savings would be per person? Between 50 cents or $1 for the average customer over several years. This is the savings.
I wonder if I could
These
spend it all in
savings
the
are
same
blowing
place.
me away, Reagan.
I hear you talking.
And there you go.
All right. Well, it is time for us to call a halt to the proceedings for this week. We do want to say thank you for the pleasure of your company. We know that you have a lot of choices out there.
But none as good as ours.
That's exactly right. So this is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
We will have a Christmas special when we see you next week. Again, thank you for your time, and we'll see you next week with another edition of the Florida Roundtable.
You've been listening to Florida Roundtable, a weekly look at issues and problems of concern to Floridians from a state, national, and international perspective. Presented by the Florida News Network with your hosts, Reagan Smith and Al Spry. The views and opinions expressed during the preceding program are solely those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station's ownership, management, or sponsors of FNN. Your views and opinions are welcome. Address your card or letter to Florida Roundtable in care of Reagan Smith, 2500 Maitland Center Parkway, Suite 407, Maitland, Florida, 32751. Or you may email reagansmith@fnnonline.com. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week for another edition of Florida Roundtable.